Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for streaming with us. At least one person is dead and more than 700,000 people are without power after a 7.0 magnitude earthquake rocked Mexico. The quake centered about 10 miles outside Acapulco, but buildings swayed as far as 200 miles away in Mexico City. Walls and power poles collapsed into streets and onto cars as people ran into the streets for safety. Mexico's National Civil Defense says it is conducting reviews in 10 states, but so far, no further reports of serious injuries. The statue of Robert E. Lee has been removed from its pedestal in Virginia's Capitol after the state Supreme Court ruled it could be taken down. The 12-ton statue is one of the largest remaining Confederate monuments in the country. It became a flashpoint last summer when Governor Ralph Northam ordered its removal amid racial justice protests. Crews will remove plaques from the pedestal tomorrow and replace a time capsule inside. And hospitals across the country are being pushed to the limit as the U.S. records more children with COVID than ever before. More than 252,000 pediatric COVID cases were reported last week, the highest weekly total yet. On average, about 365 children are being admitted to the hospital for the virus every day. Now more states are calling on military personnel for help, including in Idaho, where authorities have officially declared a crisis. Our Kaylee Hartung is there with more.
This morning, as millions of children start the school year, the U.S. setting an alarming new record. More than 252,000 children diagnosed with COVID last week, the highest number of pediatric cases since the pandemic began.
We're calling this the fourth wave, but it has certainly been by far the most impactful surge, really hitting at children and adolescents.
In Texas, where the number of children hospitalized with COVID hit an all-time high over the weekend, 11-year-old Levi Quartucci tested positive a few days after going back to school, then spent 4 days in a hospital bed.
It just felt horrible throughout the whole time.
He's now recovering after fighting for his life.
I would say to take it seriously and to protect yourselves from what can be a really, really dangerous and awful disease.
Hospitals across the country are now calling for help, and the Department of Defense is answering, sending military medics to support Alabama, Arkansas, and Idaho.
This is a war against COVID. It is not over. We are very much in the middle of the battle.
Idaho's governor calls it an unprecedented point in the state's history. The health department now activating crisis standards of care for at least 10 hospitals, warning residents they could face long wait times.
When we get short on certain supplies, oxygen or ventilator equipment or what have you, that may require us to make some tough decisions about who gets what when.
Doctors say this time around the surge feels and looks different.
We don't have to have these patients in our ICUs. Every single patient that I've seen in the intensive care unit has been unvaccinated, and they're also younger.
That was the case for 31-year-old TikToker Alexandra Blankenbiller in Florida. She wanted to do more research before getting the vaccine.
I don't have a lot of energy for talking, so I'm going to try to make this quick.
But she was too late. Blankenbiller losing her battle to the virus just days later. In this final video posted on her TikTok, the influencer encouraging her followers to get the shot.
Don't wait. Go get it. Because hopefully, if you get it, then you won't end up in the hospital like me.
Diane, in Idaho, they have one of the lowest vaccination rates in the entire country. And as you heard one doctor here say, they're in the middle of this war against COVID, and they believe it could have been preventable at this point if more people here had gotten vaccinated. But if you zoom out, bigger picture, there is some good news. Nationwide, about 75% of adults have received at least one dose of the vaccine. Diane.
All right, Kaylee Hartung in Boise, Idaho. Thanks, Kaylee. And earlier today on Good Morning America, George Stephanopoulos spoke to the dean of the Brown University School of Public Health, Dr. Ashish Jha, about the Mu variant and the surge in pediatric cases of COVID-19. Let's listen.
Dr. Jha, let's sort through some of this right now. We're hearing talk of this fourth wave, but we're really dealing with two very different Americas right now. The America where people are vaccinated, the America where people aren't.
Yeah, good morning, George. Thanks for having me here. That's exactly right. And for people who are vaccinated, they may get the infection, they may get a breakthrough, but it's going to be mild. They're not going to end up in the hospital. But for people who are not vaccinated, this is a very, very dangerous moment. People are ending up in hospitals in unprecedented numbers. And kids who are not vaccinated are getting infected largely from the adults in their lives. So we have a lot of work to do to protect kids as well.
And what do you make of this Mu variant we've been hearing talk about?
Yeah, look, there are going to be more variants. I mean, as long as it's a global pandemic and the virus rages around the world, we're going to see new variants. Mu comes from Colombia. We've had Lambda from Peru. We're going to see things like this. I'm not worried right now about the Mu variant. I don't see it displacing Delta because Delta is so contagious. I don't think Mu is going to end up taking a major hold in the U.S., but we've got to watch the data and see where it goes.
So what do we do about this surge among children right now?
Yeah, I mean, there are two things. Certainly for kids 12 and over, they should be getting vaccinated. There is no doubt about that kids will benefit from the vaccine. The question is what to do about kids under 12. And there are two parts of that. As I said earlier, kids get infected from the adults in their lives. That's the major source. If you don't want to get vaccinated for yourself, get vaccinated for your kids. And second, we've got to push the FDA to get kids under 12 vaccinated as soon as that data is available. I don't want bureaucratic slow-ups on that.
A lot of confusion about boosters as well. Who should be getting the booster shot? When can they expect to be able to get it?
Yeah, I think we'll hear more formal guidance from the FDA and CDC on this. I think the science on this really is becoming clear. Vulnerable people, older people, frail people, people with chronic diseases, they should undoubtedly be getting that third shot. The question around young, healthy people getting a third shot, I think that part, at least in my mind, is a bit more open. We'll see where the FDA and CDC land on this as well.
All right, thanks to Dr. Jha and to George for that interview. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Holmes, the former billionaire and founder of Theranos, is set to be in court today for opening statements. She was billed as the next Steve Jobs, but now she's accused of a multi-million-dollar fraud. ABC's chief economic correspondent Rebecca Jarvis is in San Jose, California with the latest.
You have anything to say to us, Elizabeth?
This morning, it's just hours away from opening statements in the criminal trial of disgraced Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes. A jury of 7 men and 5 women will hear the government's case for the very first time. The jury, which ranges in age from 19 to approximately 60, includes a recent high school graduate, a person who witnessed abuse growing up, and 2 individuals who identified English as their second language.
What would be your ideal juror if you were representing Elizabeth Holmes?
To hopefully see that there were some jurors who could identify with her as a victim and would be persuaded by her story that she was manipulated and abused by her partner.
Only days ago, a bombshell. Holmes' defense revealing she will allege she was the victim of a decade of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse at the hands of her former boyfriend and Theranos COO, Sunny Balwani. Balwani denies these allegations.
Seems like this is going to be the main focus of this trial.
Overnight, prosecutors revealing new text exchanges between the pair during the time of the alleged abuse, including these, where Elizabeth writes to Sunny, "Madly in love with you and your strength. You are a breeze in the desert for me, my water, ocean, and feel like luckiest person in world because I have you."
We will change our lives and our world.
Holmes, once the youngest female self-made billionaire, known for her distinctive voice.
First they think you're crazy, then they fight you.
And black turtlenecks, set out to change healthcare with her blood testing technology.
We've made it possible to run comprehensive laboratory tests from a tiny sample.
But now she stands accused of multi-million-dollar fraud. The Department of Justice alleging Holmes misled patients, doctors, and investors.
I know that we made so many mistakes.
Prosecutors have to prove her state of mind. They have to show that she had a criminal intent to deceive. And that's pretty difficult in cases like this.
It is rare to see defendants in cases like these testify, but we know Elizabeth Holmes almost certainly will. Her lawyers have already filed documents with the court indicating as much. And even after all of these years, Elizabeth Holmes continues going into this trial to maintain her innocence. Diane?
All right, Rebecca Jarvis, thank you. And Rebecca's following the trial in season 2 of ABC's podcast, The Dropout. Coming up, Saturday marks 20 years since the 9/11 attacks, and so many are still carrying emotional scars from the tragic events of that day. When we come back, hear the expert advice on how to cope with feelings of anger and trauma. Stay with us. Welcome back. September 11th, 2001 remains one of the most pivotal points in American history. And for the families of the fallen, the anger is still present even decades later. ABC's Morgan Norwood has their story.
Most of us can remember where we were, what we were doing, maybe even what we were wearing when we first heard the news about the attacks on 9/11.
We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at the World Trade Center.
But for the families of first responders and for many of the loved ones who died, these memories run deeper than time, place, and setting. And in Patricia Smith's case,
I don't have any independent memories of her.
They're fleeting. Smith was just a young child when she was robbed of the chance to grow up with her mother, NYPD officer Moira Smith.
It was hard to kind of hear everyone else's stories, but I didn't get that for myself.
Despite the memorials,
Moira and Smith,
the mementos,
this necklace I'm wearing is hers.
The reality of remembering comes at the cost of resentment.
It still makes me angry.
Dr. Felix Torres is a clinical and forensic scientist who has worked with survivors and families of loved ones who died in the tragedy. He's seen the gamut of emotions, but for many, the most piercing and ever-enduring emotion is the anger.
Anger can manifest itself in many ways. It could be directed at other family members. It could be directed at the government, the terrorists, even themselves and their loved ones who were lost on that day.
For Patricia Smith and her dad, the anger is in the absence of justice.
I think we both kind of have the same notion that justice delayed is justice denied. And now we're 20 years later with no justice.
So while the old adage tells us time heals all wounds, Dr. Torres will tell you it's not entirely accurate.
Time itself is not a healer.
The tributes, the services, the annual ceremony certainly hold space for healing for some, including Monica Eichen, who lost her husband. She visits the September 11th Memorial Museum often, and her connection to the museum isn't just about honor.
I couldn't bring him home, so this is his home for me.
But for others,
it may actually reopen those partially closed wounds.
Morgan Norwood, ABC News, Los Angeles.
Morgan, thank you. And for more on how to cope with the impact of 9/11 and talk to our children about the events from that day, pediatric psychologist and parent coach Dr. Anne-Louise Lockhart joins me now. Dr. Lockhart, thank you for being here. It's been nearly 20 years now since the 9/11 attacks. The trauma, the grief, the shock from that day was felt around the world. So before we talk to our kids about 9/11, what questions do we as parents need to ask ourselves?
Yes, thank you for having me, Diane. I think that it's important that, we lived through this. We saw what was going on. We saw what was happening in real time. And so I think we have to find out what we're feeling in ourselves before we speak to our kids, how we're feeling about it. And when we talk to them about it, I would say ask them what they already know, because they may be talking to their teachers, their peers, maybe they're seeing it on social media or online. And I would say before you even have a discussion with your kids about it, find out what is it that you already know and just see what they tell you. And then I think you should take it from there. And then based on that, as they're talking and as you're talking to them about it, monitoring your emotional state as you speak to them, because this event brings up a lot of feelings for us since we lived through it. So monitor your emotional state, monitor how you're feeling as you discuss it with them. And I think that's going to be super important. And then as you do that, share how you feel about it, but don't overshare. That's going to be the balance. As you're talking about it, all the emotions that come up for you, they're going to ask a ton of questions, but we don't want to burden them with our emotions, and we don't want to burden them with too much information.
So how do you strike that right balance between helping your kids understand the reality of what happened that day versus protecting their innocence and just letting them be kids? How do you decide how much to tell them?
Yeah, that's a great question, Diane. I think a lot of our kids know a lot more than we ever did at their age 20, 30, 40 years ago. So we can still protect their innocence by really being aware of what we're sharing with them so that we ask them. That's why I think starting out with finding out what they know is so important, because they may know a lot more details than we think they do. And once we go from there, we can say, you know what, there's a lot of things that have occurred in our history, in the world and in our nation that don't feel too good and that aren't really positive. And that's okay, because we can talk through it, we can work through it, and then we can find the good people that helped us get through it. And I think that's really important to strike that balance and saying, yes, this was a really terrible event, but you know what? Let's talk about the good people that helped us get through it. And let's talk about how we can remember it in a way that's positive for ourselves.
You're reminding me of that famous Mr. Rogers episode when he talks about finding the helpers. And that may parlay into my next question, which is after traumatic events like 9/11, and even right now, just living in a pandemic, how do we assure our children that they're safe in what can feel like unsafe times?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to be honest with them that say, you know what, it doesn't feel safe. And I feel uncomfortable at times too. And it does feel heavy with everything that we're seeing. But you know that they have to realize that they're adults in their lives, they're caregivers, they're parents, they're teachers. We're here to keep you safe. And that's not just physical safety, but it's also emotional safety. Knowing that they can come to us whenever they have a struggle. If they have a question about something that they feel unsure about, that they know they can always go to us, grandma, grandpa, dad, mom, teacher, and that they know that we are a safe place for them to hold that for them. And I think that's where we can really strike the balance to say, you know what, whatever question you have, I may not know the answer, but we'll find it out together.
All right, Dr. Ann Louise Lockhart, great to talk to you. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
And as America reflects on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, ABC News and ABC News Live will have live coverage. 9/11, 20 years later, America remembers this Saturday beginning at 8 a.m. Eastern. Coming up, former ABC News correspondent Ann Compton spent 9/11 like few others, traveling on Air Force One with then President Bush. When we come back, what she remembers about watching that day unfold with the president. Welcome back. As we mark 20 years since the 9/11 attacks, former ABC News White House correspondent Ann Compton has a very unique vantage point. She spent that day traveling on Air Force One while covering President Bush as the day unfolded. Recently, ABC News Live Prime anchor Lindsay Davis spoke with Ann about what she remembers and what 9/11 means to her 20 years later.
We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at the World Trade Center.
It was just minutes before Good Morning America was supposed to end on September 11th, 2001.
We don't know if it would have been deliberate or accidental. We know so little now.
But the hours ahead would become a day no one would ever forget.
We just saw another plane coming in from the side.
Our belief at the moment is that an aircraft has crashed into either the courtyard itself or into that particular side of the building. There is simply no way to accurately describe the emotion this evokes.
Anchor Peter Jennings and ABC News correspondents across the country were there to guide us through the day. As the day unfolded, one correspondent was there to update us on then President George W. Bush.
Ann Compton, who's been with the president all day, is on the phone.
He and what skeleton staff are with him down into an underground bunker where Ari Fleischer tells me the president is going to chair a National Security Council meeting.
Now, 20 years later, Ann tells us what she remembers about that day in the skies above a nation under attack.
And if you can take us back to that day, Emma Booker Elementary in Sarasota, Florida, that morning, kind of replay those moments when someone comes in and whispers into the president's ear.
It was a quiet day, the last stop on a 3-day trip. The agenda was education. He'd given the speech 1,000,000 times. So in this innocent setting,
running.
I was stunned to see White House Chief of Staff Andy Card come into the classroom and whisper to the president. Nobody interrupts a president, even in front of a classroom of second graders. But what forced me to write down in my reporter's notebook, 9:07 a.m., Andy whispers, was the look on President Bush's face. There was a gravity to it that was stunning. Andy stepped back, and I caught his eye. We had heard there had been a plane crash, and I made the sign of an airplane with my hand. Andy Card nodded and put up 2 fingers. That was the confirmation that this wasn't some tragic accident. It strikes me that looking back 20 years later, what we know now is what the president knew at that moment, and we did not. The president had already asked the intelligence community, what could al-Qaeda do to hurt Americans on U.S. soil? And that whisper was his answer.
When did the magnitude of the moment really hit you?
Actually, at the school, those of us traveling with the president, and even the president himself, knew so much less than everybody else in the country. We weren't by a television set watching the first plane and watching the second plane. So I figured it was bad when the president stood up, said, "Excuse me," he went into the other room. We were rushed out of the school classroom, just the small travel pool that was in the back of the classroom, rushed out the door into a school parking lot.
At what point did it really hit you as far as taking your reporter hat off and the implications of this as a citizen?
I don't think there was ever a moment when the emotional side, the personal fear side of this ever hit. Even when we raced off to the airport, boarded Air Force One, and as soon as we got on Air Force One, we learned the Pentagon had been hit. So we knew we weren't going back to Washington. I wasn't scared for us in the plane. I wasn't afraid for the president's safety. I was appalled and shocked and heartbroken for the people on the ground.
And then take us back to the first time you get on the air with Peter Jennings, and you have just a few facts and there's so much chaos.
All I could tell Peter Jennings and the world was that the president said this was a apparent terrorist attack. He was returning to Washington. But I also knew that the Secret Service takes any threat anywhere and assumes it is a diversionary tactic, and the real target is the president of the United States. So at that moment, my job was to say, the president's safe, he's on the move, he's going to be on the airplane, and we have no idea where we're going.
And what was that like for you, boarding Air Force One, and then you're just flying, you don't know where?
There was a sense of this was the fog of war. In this case, the fog was as thick as that smoke billowing through lower Manhattan by that point. We knew there were attacks on the building. We heard that the Pentagon was in flames. The fear was, how broad did this go? The enormity of it was absolutely lost on us because on Air Force One, the only information we had as we flew for hours was a hazy picture on the television screens that are embedded in the front bulkhead wall of each cabin on Air Force One. And the president, in his cabin up forward, was furious and frustrated.
People often talked about in the aftermath, and continue to, the idea of we will not forget. What do you feel that Americans ought to remember on this 20th anniversary?
On September 11th, the country came together in a way we hadn't seen in a long time, helping each other. There was a sense of trying to protect your neighbors, take in people, trying to preserve what was best about the society that we had that was under attack. I think if I could tell my grandchildren who are preschool what they should know about America and the impact of September 11th, is that this is a country that needs to pull together and act as one United States and a society that upholds principles of democracy and fairness and freedom. And that has to be our core. And that's what the important lesson of 2 decades taught me, and what I hope they can carry forward.
Our thanks to Ann Compton and Lindsay Davis for that interview. And as America reflects on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, ABC News and ABC News Live will have live coverage. 9/11, 20 years later, America Remembers airs this Saturday beginning at 8 a.m. Eastern. And that does it for this newscast. I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for joining us. And remember, ABC News Live is here for you all day with the latest news, context, and analysis. We'll be right back here at 3 p.m. Eastern with Terry Moran for The Breakdown. Stay safe, everybody.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.